World War II was a vast and terrible conflict. It stretched across the globe from the deserts of North Africa to the islands of the Pacific Ocean. Many great battles were fought, but, few were as important or as brutal as the Battle of Stalingrad. This was not just another fight over a piece of land. It was a clash of wills between two of the most powerful leaders in history, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. The battle became a symbol. For Germany, it was a symbol of their ambition to conquer the East. For the Soviet Union, it became a symbol of their fierce determination to defend their homeland at any cost. The outcome of this struggle would change the course of the entire war. The battle for the city named after the Soviet leader was more than a military engagement, it was a psychological war. The propaganda machines on both sides worked tirelessly, turning the city into the ultimate prize. For the German soldiers marching east, taking Stalingrad meant breaking the back of the Soviet resistance. For the Soviet defenders, holding the city meant stopping the seemingly unstoppable German war machine. The sheer scale of the fighting was immense, drawing in millions of soldiers. The struggle was not just for control of a city, but for the momentum of the war itself. Whoever won at Stalingrad would gain a massive advantage, not just on the Eastern Front, but in the entire global conflict. The story of Stalingrad is a story of incredible suffering and unbelievable bravery. It shows what human beings are capable of, both in their cruelty and in their resilience. The fighting was not done on open fields, but in the streets, in the factories, and in the rubble of a once great city. Every building became a fortress. Every room was a battlefield. The battle consumed men and machines at a terrifying rate. Understanding what happened at Stalingrad is essential to understanding the Second World War. It was here, on the banks of the Volga River, that the seemingly invincible German army suffered a defeat from which it would never truly recover. Before Stalingrad, the German military, the Wehrmacht, had swept across Europe with stunning speed. Country after country had fallen before their blitzkrieg tactics. When they invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, many in the world expected a quick German victory. For over a year, the German armies pushed deeper and deeper into Soviet territory, but Stalingrad would be different. This battle would become the ultimate test of endurance for both sides. It marked the point where the tide of war in the East began to turn. The epic struggle for this one city on the Volga River would become a defining moment of the 20th century, a testament to the horrors of total war. The Battle of Stalingrad was fought between two main powers. On one side was Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler. The German army, known as the Wehrmacht, was one of the most powerful and well-trained military forces in the world at the time. Its soldiers were confident, having won many victories across Europe. They were supported by allies, including troops from Italy, Romania, and Hungary. The main German force attacking Stalingrad was the Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus. This was a large and experienced army, considered one of the best in the German military. They were equipped with modern tanks, artillery, and were supported by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. On the other side was the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin. The Soviet military was called the Red Army. At the beginning of the war, the Red Army had suffered huge losses. Many of its soldiers were new recruits with little training. However, what they lacked in experience, they made up for in numbers and a fierce will to defend their country. Stalin had issued a famous order, not a step back. This meant that any soldier who retreated without orders could be shot. The main Soviet force defending the city was the 62nd Army, led by General Vasily Chuikov. His job was to hold the city at all costs, no matter how many soldiers he lost. The two armies were very different in their approach. The Germans relied on their superior tactics, training, and equipment. Their strategy was based on blitzkrieg or lightning war, using fast-moving tanks and coordinated airstrikes to encircle and destroy their enemies quickly. They expected to take Stalingrad with the same speed and efficiency they had shown in other campaigns. They believed in their technological and organizational superiority. For the German command, this was another objective on a map, a city to be conquered as part of a grand strategic plan to secure the resources of the Caucasus region and cripple the Soviet Union. The Soviets, however, had to adapt. They could not match the Germans in open battle at this stage of the war. General Chuikov developed a new tactic. He ordered his soldiers to fight the Germans as closely as possible. He called this hugging the enemy. This meant the fighting was often hand-to-hand in the rubble of buildings. This close-quarters combat made it difficult for the German Luftwaffe to bomb Soviet positions without risking hitting their own troops. The Red Army learned to use the ruined city as a weapon, turning every pile of bricks into a defensive position. Their fight was not just tactical, it was a desperate struggle for survival. The battle took place in and around the city of Stalingrad. Today this city is called Volgograd. It is located in the southwestern part of Russia. The city stretches for many miles along the western bank of the wide Volga River. The battle began in the summer of 1942 and raged through the harsh Russian winter, finally ending in early 1943. The fighting started on August 23, 1942, when the German Sixth Army reached the outskirts of the city. The battle officially concluded on February 2, 1943, when the last German forces surrendered. This period of just over 5 months saw some of the most intense and destructive fighting in human history. Stalingrad was a major industrial city before the war. It was filled with large factories that produced tractors, tanks, and other important goods for the Soviet Union. The city had big, modern buildings and a population of over 400,000 people. Its location on the Volga River was very important. The Volga is one of Russia's most vital waterways, a major transport route connecting the north of the country with the south. Control of the river was crucial for moving supplies, oil, and troops. The city itself was a long, narrow strip of urban development, making it difficult to surround completely without also controlling the river. The geography of the area played a huge role in the battle. To the west of the city was the open, flat steppe, which was ideal terrain for the German tanks to advance across. However, once they reached the city itself, this advantage disappeared. The urban landscape of factories, apartment blocks, and narrow streets became a nightmare for armored vehicles. The Volga River to the east became a lifeline for the Soviet defenders. Under constant German bombing and artillery fire, Soviet boats and barges ferried reinforcements, ammunition, and food across the river into the city. They also carried the wounded back to the relative safety of the eastern bank. The weather was another critical factor. The battle began in the heat of late summer, but as autumn turned to winter, the infamous Russian cold set in. Temperatures dropped to far below freezing, sometimes reaching -30 degrees Celsius, or even lower. The German soldiers were not properly equipped for such extreme cold. They lacked warm winter clothing, and their equipment often failed in the freezing temperatures. The Red Army soldiers, on the other hand, were more accustomed to the harsh winters and were better prepared. The snow and ice that covered the landscape made movement difficult and added to the misery of the soldiers on both sides. Adolf Hitler was obsessed with capturing Stalingrad for several important reasons. Firstly, the city was a major industrial and transportation hub for the Soviet Union. Its factories produced vital war materials, including the famous T-34 tank. By capturing Stalingrad, Germany could cripple Soviet industrial production in the region. More importantly, the city sat on the Volga River, a critical artery for the Soviet economy. Controlling Stalingrad would allow the Germans to cut off the transport of oil from the Caucasus oil fields to the rest of the Soviet Union. Without this oil, the Soviet war machine, its tanks, planes, and trucks, would grind to a halt. Secondly, capturing Stalingrad was a key part of a larger German plan for 1942, known as Case Blue. The main goal of this summer offensive was to seize the rich oil fields in the Caucasus region, to the south of Stalingrad. Hitler believed that securing this oil was essential for Germany to continue fighting a long war. The German army was split into two groups. Army Group A was to push south into the Caucasus to capture the oil fields. Army Group B, which included the Sixth Army, was tasked with protecting the northern flank of this advance. Capturing Stalingrad was seen as necessary to secure this flank and prevent Soviet counterattacks. However, the city's name held a powerful symbolic importance that went beyond military strategy. The city was named after the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. For Hitler, capturing Stalin's city would be a huge personal and propaganda victory. It would be a way to humiliate his archenemy on the world stage. This obsession grew as the battle raged on. The fight for Stalingrad became less about a strategic objective and more about prestige and ideology. Hitler refused to consider bypassing the city. He wanted it taken, no matter the cost in German lives. This personal fixation would prove to be a fatal mistake. For Joseph Stalin, the same symbolism made defending the city an absolute necessity. He could not allow the city bearing his name to fall into enemy hands. It would be a devastating blow to Soviet morale and a massive propaganda victory for the Germans. This is why he issued his "not a step back" order and poured enormous numbers of troops and resources into the city's defense. The battle thus became a personal duel between the two dictators, fought by millions of their soldiers in the ruins of the city. The strategic value of the city was immense, but it was the symbolic value that turned the battle into the meat grinder it became. The German summer offensive of 1942, codenamed Operation Blue, began with great success. The Wehrmacht pushed deep into southern Russia, advancing hundreds of miles across the steppes. By late August, the German 6th Army, under General Paulus, had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. On August 23, 1942, the assault on the city began in earnest. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, launched a massive bombing raid. Thousands of tons of incendiary and high-explosive bombs were dropped on the city. The initial air raid killed tens of thousands of civilians and turned much of the wooden housing into a sea of fire. The city was quickly transformed into a smoking ruin. Following the devastating air attacks, German panzer divisions broke through to the Volga River just north of Stalingrad, effectively cutting the city off by land. The initial German plan was to encircle the Soviet 62nd Army within the city and destroy it quickly. The German soldiers were confident. They had overcome every obstacle so far and expected Stalingrad to fall within a matter of weeks, if not days. They began to push into the shattered city from the west and south, expecting the Soviet defenders to collapse under the pressure of their coordinated ground and air assault. The initial advances were swift as they moved into the suburbs. However, the Soviet defenders did not break. Under the command of General Vasily Chuikov, the 62nd Army prepared to fight for every street, every house, and every pile of rubble. Chuikov understood that he could not defeat the Germans in a conventional battle. Instead, he ordered his men to turn the city itself into a fortress. Snipers hid in the ruins, picking off German soldiers. Small groups of soldiers, called storm groups, armed with submachine guns, grenades, and anti-tank rifles, would defend buildings to the last man. The fighting became a slow, brutal process of clearing one building at a time, a type of warfare the Germans called Rattenkrieg, or Rat War. The nature of the fighting negated many of the German advantages. In the narrow, debris-choked streets, German tanks were vulnerable to ambush by Soviet infantry with anti-tank weapons. The close-quarters combat meant that the powerful German artillery and air force could not be used effectively without endangering their own troops. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. A single apartment building, a grain elevator, or a factory complex could be the scene of savage fighting for days or even weeks. The initial German optimism began to fade as the casualty lists grew longer and the promised quick victory failed to materialize. The city was not falling, it was swallowing the German army whole. Life for the soldiers fighting in Stalingrad was honestly a living nightmare. The fighting was constant, brutal, and intensely personal. Battles weren't fought across open fields, but from room to room inside shattered buildings, in sewers, and through networks of trenches dug through the rubble. A position could be captured in the morning, lost in the afternoon, and, recaptured again by night. Soldiers lived in a state of constant fear and exhaustion. The ever-present threat of sniper fire meant that even a moment's carelessness could be fatal. There's a telling account from a German soldier who wrote that they had captured the kitchen of a house, but the living room was still held by the Soviets. The front line was everywhere. Food, water, and ammunition were always in short supply, especially for the Soviet defenders who relied on dangerous nighttime crossings of the Volga River. For the men of the 62nd Army, the average life expectancy of a new soldier arriving in the city was sometimes less than 24 hours. They lived in damp, cold cellars and holes dug in the ground, surrounded by filth and the constant presence of death. The noise of battle was unending, the roar of planes, the crash of artillery, the rattle of machine guns, and the screams of the wounded. Sleep was a rare luxury, often interrupted by sudden attacks or shelling. Both sides suffered terribly from disease, lice, and malnutrition. The civilians who were trapped in the city suffered unimaginably. When the battle began, hundreds of thousands of residents were still in Stalingrad. Stalin had refused to evacuate them, believing their presence would make the soldiers fight harder. Many were killed in the initial German bombing raids. Those who survived were left to fend for themselves in the middle of a war zone. They hid in basements and sewers, desperately searching for food and water. They were caught in the crossfire, used as forced labor, and died from starvation, disease, and the bitter cold. Their story is, honestly, one of the great tragedies of the battle. As the battle dragged on into autumn and winter, the conditions grew even worse. Rain turned the dusty ruins into a sea of mud. Then the temperatures plummeted. For the German soldiers, the Russian winter was a terrifying new enemy. They were not issued with proper winter clothing, and many suffered from severe frostbite, which often led to amputations. Their weapons and vehicles froze and became useless. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers on both sides witnessed horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Stalingrad was not just a battle. It was a descent into a primitive struggle for survival in one of the most hellish environments ever created by man. While the German Sixth Army was being slowly bled dry in the street fighting of Stalingrad, the Soviet High Command was busy planning a massive counter-offensive. The plan was given the codename Operation Uranus. The Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, one of the best commanders of the war, was put in charge. The Soviets had secretly gathered over 1 million soldiers, along with thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, on the flanks of the German forces at Stalingrad. These flanks, stretching for many miles across the open steppe to the north and south of the city, were not held by the elite German Sixth Army. Instead, they were defended by weaker Romanian and Italian armies. On November 19, 1942, in the middle of a blinding snowstorm, the Soviets launched their attack. The main thrusts came from the north and the south of the German lines. The Soviet tanks and infantry smashed through the poorly equipped Romanian positions. The Romanian soldiers, who lacked effective anti-tank weapons and were not prepared for the ferocity of the assault, were quickly overwhelmed. Their lines collapsed, and they began a panicked retreat. The Soviet armored spearheads drove deep into the German rear, racing across the frozen plains to meet each other and complete their encirclement. The speed and power of the Soviet attack caught the German command completely by surprise. Just 4 days later, on November 23rd, the two Soviet forces met at the town of Kalach, west of Stalingrad. The trap was sprung. The entire German Sixth Army, along with parts of the 4th Panzer Army, a force of around 300,000 men, was now completely surrounded. General Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army, realized the extreme danger of his situation. He requested permission from Hitler to attempt a breakout, to fight his way out of the trap, before the Soviet ring tightened. He believed it was the only way to save his army from annihilation. However, Hitler, sitting in his headquarters far away in Germany, flatly refused. Hitler was assured by the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, that the Air Force could supply the trapped army by air. Göring promised to fly in hundreds of tons of food, fuel, and ammunition every day. This airlift was, honestly, a fantasy. The Luftwaffe did not have enough transport planes, the weather was terrible, and the Soviet Air Force and anti-aircraft guns made the flights extremely dangerous. The airlift was a catastrophic failure. The trapped German soldiers received only a tiny fraction of the supplies they needed to survive and fight. Hitler's orders had condemned the Sixth Army to a slow death by starvation and cold inside the pocket, which the Germans called the cauldron. Trapped inside the Stalingrad pocket, the condition of the German Sixth Army deteriorated rapidly. The winter of 1942-43 was exceptionally cold, and the soldiers were starving. The failed airlift meant that rations were cut again and again, until men were surviving on just a few ounces of bread a day. They ate their horses, then dogs, cats, and, well, anything else they could find. Ammunition ran low. Medical supplies were exhausted, and thousands of wounded men died from their injuries, frostbite, and disease. The soldiers were skeletons in rags, huddling in frozen trenches and basements, with little hope of rescue. In December, the Germans made one last attempt to save the Sixth Army. A relief force called Operation Winterstorm was launched under the command of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. His panzer divisions fought their way towards Stalingrad from the south. For a moment it seemed like they might succeed. They came within 30 miles of the pocket, close enough for the trapped soldiers to see the flashes of their guns on the horizon. But Paulus was still forbidden by Hitler to attempt a breakout to meet them. Without a breakout, Manstein's force was not strong enough to break through the Soviet lines on its own. The relief attempt failed, and the last glimmer of hope for the Sixth Army vanished. By January 1943, the situation inside the cauldron was hopeless. The Soviets launched their final offensive, Operation Ring, to crush the remaining German resistance. They squeezed the pocket from all sides, splitting it into smaller and smaller pieces. The German soldiers were too weak from hunger and cold to put up much of a fight. They surrendered in their thousands. On January 30th, the anniversary of him coming to power, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. No German field marshal had ever surrendered, and Hitler expected Paulus to commit suicide rather than be captured. Paulus did not commit suicide. On January 31, 1943, he surrendered his headquarters in the basement of a department store. The remaining German forces in the northern part of the city surrendered 2 days later, on February 2nd. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of the nearly 300,000 men who had been trapped in the pocket, around 91,000 were taken prisoner. The rest were dead. The fate of the prisoners was grim. Weakened by starvation and disease, they were marched across the frozen steppes to Soviet prison camps. Only about 5,000 of them would ever see Germany again. The once proud Sixth Army had been completely destroyed. The Battle of Stalingrad was a decisive turning point in World War II, especially on the Eastern Front. Before Stalingrad, the German army seemed invincible. They had conquered most of Europe and had driven deep into the Soviet Union. After Stalingrad, the myth of German invincibility was shattered forever. The catastrophic loss of the entire Sixth Army was a blow from which the German military would never fully recover. It was not just the loss of nearly 300,000 experienced soldiers, it was also the loss of vast amounts of equipment, tanks, artillery, and aircraft, that Germany, already stretched thin, could not easily replace. For the Soviet Union, the victory at Stalingrad was a tremendous boost to morale. It proved that the Red Army could not only stop the Germans, but could also defeat and destroy them. The victory inspired the Soviet people and soldiers to continue their fight with renewed determination. From this point forward, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed to the Soviets. For the next 2 years, the Red Army would be on the offensive, pushing the German army steadily backward, all the way to Berlin. The long and bloody road to victory began in the ruins of Stalingrad. The victory came at a terrible cost, with the Soviets suffering over 1 million casualties in the campaign. The defeat had a profound impact within Germany. For the first time, the German public could not ignore the scale of the disaster. The government announced 3 days of national mourning, and propaganda could no longer hide the fact that the war in the East was going badly. Doubts about Hitler's leadership began to grow, both among the general population and within the military high command. The loss at Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. While the war would continue for more than 2 years, the ultimate outcome was no longer in doubt for many observers. Germany was now fighting a defensive war on 2 fronts that it could not win. In conclusion, the Battle of Stalingrad remains one of the most significant and symbolic battles in modern history. It was the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought, a brutal testament to the horrors of total war. It stopped the German advance into the Soviet Union and marked the beginning of a long and costly Soviet push towards Berlin. The battle's importance goes beyond the military statistics. It was a clash of ideologies and wills, a struggle that defined the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering. The sacrifice made by the soldiers and civilians at Stalingrad fundamentally changed the course of World War II and shaped the world we live in today.